and welcome. I'm Rami Niranjan Desai, and my guest for this interview today is Dr. Michael Schluter. He is an economist, a policy researcher, and founder of Britain's Relationships Foundation. He has worked as an applied economist with the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, and the World Bank. He is currently president and CEO of Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives. He has also written a very interesting book on Korea called No Other Way to Peace in Korea, a practical path to reunification. We are today going to be discussing his book and much more. Welcome, Dr. Schluter.
Thank you.
Dr. Schluter, let me begin by asking you about your book. It seems to provide a very different perspective on the question of unification of the Korean Peninsula. Why do you propose it is important to build social and economic interdependence to bridge the gap of political ideologies on both sides?
Well, it's a wonderful question, a rather challenging question. I have to say, you've gone right to the heart of the issue, right at the beginning of this interview. If you go back to what the North Koreans were saying in September 2020, their ambassador to the UN in New York made a statement to the UN General Assembly in which he said, North Korea is looking for two things, economic modernization and respect. Now, what does respect really mean? And I think the world regards them, as you know, as a rogue state, as being of little value. They don't recognize its political, economic, social system as having any validity or usefulness. Whereas South Korea, one of the most successful success stories in economic growth in the world, is highly regarded for its liberal democratic order. That's the context of this discussion. Now, I've taken a rather provocative view on this in two respects. One, I think that North Korea actually has achieved an enormous amount if you start to look more carefully at how its system actually operates. They are Koreans, like South Korea. They work energetically, they're thoughtful, innovative, productive, just like South Korea is as well. And when you start to look carefully at the way that they've set up, for example, their health system or their education system, or many other aspects of their social organization, you could say that they are equally as impressive as South Korea, only they've been constrained by economic sanctions for so long, which have made it very difficult for them to operate. If you look at South Korea in more detail, you find that they've got some major problems, actually. The most obvious of those is that they have this very, very low population growth rate. So the number of children per adult woman is 0.7 now, whereas you need 2.07 to have a sustainable society. That means that within, 20 or 30 years, their workforce will be halved from 39 million down to 19 million. Now, it's very difficult for a country to survive if it's got an aging population and no children coming through. So in 1980, they had 1 million children every year going into university in South Korea. Now they only have 200,000. But the roots of that demographic decline are long hours of work, 70 hours a week, typically, and an hour or two commuting each way to the office in their big city of Seoul, which is where a huge proportion of the population live. You've got the education system, which is all about individual achievement. You've got so many factors, the high housing costs, so many other factors which are driving down birth rates. But if you haven't got time to date, you haven't got time to form a relationship, to get married, to have children, if you can't do those things, what kind of life have you got, really? Now, is that human rights abuse? I don't know. It isn't classified as human rights abuse, whereas if you put people into detention centers, that is human rights abuse in the Western definitions of human rights. So all I'm saying is it's not quite as simple as it looks. And we think that there are positive elements in North Korea's political and economic arrangements, but there are also positive elements in South Korea. So we think that they both have something to offer to each other if they were able to come together. So that's why we think a growing process of what we call mutual convergent development would be helpful for both sides in terms of bringing their societies to a higher level.
So, Dr. Schluter, then do you think that the economic model of organization as was adopted by post-war Europe is relevant to be applied to South and North Korea?
Well, I don't think the economic model of organization is relevant, but what I do think is relevant and important is how they resolved the problems between France and Germany. Because after the Second World War, looking at 1949, so just after India's independence from the UK, in 1949, France and Germany were about to start a Third World War over the coal and iron resources in the Ruhr Valley, which lies between France and Germany, which was the heart of the armaments industry for Germany. And both of them claimed ownership, occupation of that area, and they were willing to fight for it. Then somebody came up with this suggestion, well, why don't you form a European coal and steel community, i.e. let's have free trade for that area. Let's have those areas, in a sense, jointly controlled by France and Germany, but France and Germany able to trade those goods, key goods, iron and coal, both of which are the basis of steel production and armaments production. But also they brought in Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands. So there were 6 of them, which formed the European coal and steel community. After 5 years, it became the European Economic Community, which I was brought up with, and then it became the European Community, and in the end, the European Union. And what we've suggested in the book is, well, why not form a similar starting point between North and South Korea? Simply start with a trade agreement. In this case, agricultural goods from North Korea, fish, nuts, kimchi, cabbage, which is a garnish they use a lot in Korea, and those kinds of things. And let South Korea export to North Korea a lot of the agricultural machinery, fertilizers, improved seeds, improved livestock, all of those things which South Korea has, which it could trade up to North Korea. Both would benefit, both would grow, but this is a trade agreement. Mutual respect is shown by both parties. It's not an aid agreement, but a trade agreement. That's what we suggest in the book as a starting point to get things going.
Correct. But that would also, to my understanding, require some amount of trust building, some amount of faith between the two countries. Now, you also have been talking about in some detail about core peace building concepts such as mutual respect, building trust, and forgiveness. Now, while these factors worked very well in the case of peace building in South Africa, what do you think could be the cultural challenges of implementing it on the Korean Peninsula?
Mm. You have searching questions. In South Africa, when we were involved, the key way in which we contributed to the peace process in South Africa was back in the period leading up to the release of Nelson Mandela, and just after that, and before the formal talks began between the ANC and the white establishment. And the issues there were the ANC's wish to nationalize the land, nationalize the banks, nationalize the mines, and as it were, just express total government control in a sort of socialist communist kind of way. And it goes back to the Freedom Charter, actually, in 1955. Obviously, those were completely unacceptable to the white national government. And what we were able to do was bring the two sides together for a number of high-level meetings, all behind the scenes, I should say. Nothing was in the press. And that was important for the freedom of the discussion and the freedom to build relationships without any political posturing between the two sides, in order to get them to resolve those key points of difference in a way that was satisfactory to both sides. that was the beginning of building trust. Now, we were able to move on from that, but after we had worked on those discussions, we got out of the way, as it were, because the formal Codesa talks came into play and only came back at the very last minute when there was some threat of the Zulus not participating in the election, which would have been a disaster at the time. And then, as you know, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was able to grant amnesty and, in a sense, the opportunity for forgiveness to be expressed where people wanted it, where members of the security forces in South Africa, for the South African government, which had tortured and killed ANC members, and where ANC members had done random attacks on the white public in South Africa, to come forward and admit everything that they had done, how they'd done it, everything, in return for amnesty. So no one would ever prosecute them in the future. Now, we believe that it's a combination of both building trust through economic and social joint enterprise, joint development, mutual convergent development in our language on the one side, and then things like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the other, which allows the grievances and pain of the past to be articulated and people to hear that their stories have been heard. Both of those are key aspects of forgiveness. And also, you do want to mobilize those faith traditions that have forgiveness as part of their narrative to engage strongly with their of those people who are members of their faiths, to emphasize the importance of forgiveness.
Quite right. On this note, you've earlier mentioned in the interview that North Korea has been perceived as a rogue state, and internationally so. Now, do you think, could you elaborate a little bit more on how this perception needs to be reformed in order to engage better with the country? And what sort of role can the international community play in this regard?
Well, I think it's regarded as a rogue state mainly because it's pursued nuclear weapons. And obviously, this is representing more and more of a threat to the United States. Now, South Korea wants its own nuclear weapons, which it's quite capable of making very quickly if it wants to. And so does Japan, by the way. So you can imagine from China's point of view, this is a little concerning to have North Korea, South Korea, and Japan with nuclear weapons all on their doorstep. But, and then they've got Taiwan to worry about as well, which is another big problem because you've got, the US sitting behind Japan to some degree at least. So there's huge problems there. But I think the main reason North Korea is regarded as the rogue state is why do they go on firing off these missiles all the time? And I think what people don't really understand is, from a North Korean perspective, they remember very well how the US bombed their cities, to nothing in, the 51-53 Korean War. I think there was one building left in Pyongyang, that's all. So left standing. I mean, it was obliterated. And so many of them remember that, and it's replayed on their television, central TV all the time. And then they think, well, countries that have denuclearized, think Libya or Ukraine, have not really benefited from that. I mean, Libya got, Gaddafi got wiped out by US and UK bombers in 2005, flattened again. And they're thinking, well, if we can't defend ourselves, we're being asked to unilaterally disarm. This is not the US saying, look, we'll get rid of our nuclear weapons if you get rid of yours. No, they're not talking about that at all. We'll keep our nuclear arsenal, but you get rid of yours and leave yourself defenseless if we choose to attack you in the future. And what North Korea is saying, we can't do that because what guarantee can you give us that we can trust and believe in for the future? That's their point of view. And looking at it as a third party coming in fresh to the situation 5 years ago, I can see their perspective. I can understand why they feel that. So there is a possibility, though, to move forward. now because the US has said, we are willing to go for incremental economic modernization in return for incremental denuclearization. So you could do it on a step-by-step basis as the two things go in parallel. Well, that's a wonderful way to start this off. Seems to me totally feasible to start in that way. But I think it's important for the international community to realize that the point at which North Korea will feel really happy to totally denuclearize, take those last steps of really leaving behind nuclear weapons, is at the point where there is reunification of the peninsula. And that's when it could really happen, denuclearization in total. But steps towards that, for example, stopping firing missiles or stopping the joint military exercises, which South Korea and the US do, and where their planes, US and South Korean planes, fly just off the coast of Pyongyang. They don't go and do these military exercises somewhere out in the Pacific. They do it clearly within sight of the North Korean residents. That's what upsets North Korea so much. So until those fundamental things change, which they regard as provocative, until something is put on the table that they really want, then they're not going to be willing to denuclearize, I think.
So, if I grasp this correctly, your assessment proposes that the denuclearization of North Korea will eventually happen as the unification of the peninsula takes place. But the current South Korean president has also made denuclearization of North Korea prerequisite for any economic assistance to the country. Does that make the chances for peace somewhat bleak?
Well, I think what North Korea does not want is aid, because from their point of view, it's sort of demeaning. They feel in Confucian categories, which has been so prevalent in East Asia, as you know, in Confucian thought, there's a younger brother, older brother narrative going on here. So the older brother gives help, aid to the younger brother, and the younger brother then has to do what the older brother wants. And North Korea does not want to be seen as a younger brother in this context. They always thought they were the older brother. Actually, I think until about 1980, they were military and economically more successful. But now South Korea has made such a lot of advances economically that North Korea financially is at a disadvantage. But in nuclear terms, they've still got an edge. So they don't want aid. Aid is for them patronizing. An offer of aid is simply patronizing. However, President Yoon's bold, audacious was the word he used, audacious initiative. His audacious initiative shows he's thinking in much more radical terms than South Korean presidents have thought in the past. He's saying, look, we have got all the things that North Korea needs to modernize its economy. They've got the help for the infrastructure development, the power development, the transport equipment, the all the technology required for, the mining sector and everything else. So they could help North Korea a great deal, but North Korea won't accept it as aid. So if you move beyond a Korean Peninsula agriculture community to a Korean Peninsula economic community, like Europe moved from a European coal and steel community to a European economic community, so you allow trade across everything, not just around agriculture, but across all goods. North Korea's got incredible mineral resources, and it could be exporting all those mineral resources down to South Korea if there was this bilateral trade permitted by the international community. So we're suggesting that in order to get the peace process going between North and South Korea, which we regard as the primary thing to focus on, not the North Korea-US relationship, but the North Korea relationship to South Korea. And if North and South Korea jointly then negotiate with the US for the necessary sanctions exemptions, we think the international community all have an interest in supporting that kind of peace process. That's the foundation of what this book says. All members of the Security Council could sign off on this process of incrementalism, incremental sanctions exemptions in parallel with incremental denuclearization, steps towards denuclearization.
Thank you, Dr. Schluter, for that really fresh perspective. But let me come to my last question. What impact then do you think that this reunification of the Korean Peninsula have on the regional security of East Asia?
Well, I think the critical question is going to be, would a reunified Korea be US facing or China facing? So the threat at the moment is that the denuclearized zone, the DMZ, that separates North and South Korea, would become the new Berlin Wall of Asia. You know, you've got two proxy states, which are, well, they're proxies for great powers, China and US, and now they're confronting each other across the DMZ through their proxies, North Korea and South Korea. And that happened in the Korean War, in a sense. But we're saying that if there was a reunified Korea, would this reunified Korea be pro-US or pro-China? And we're suggesting that if they adopt what we're proposing in the book, which is a third way from either socialism or capitalism, we've called it, think French Revolution, think liberté, capitalism, égalité, socialism, emphasis. What's the third angle of the triangle, the third part of the slogan? It's fraternity. It's how do you emphasize the relationships and community values in the way you set up your entire economic, political, social system? Think Switzerland in terms of confederal society rather than the traditional way we think about federal societies as being rather top down. Anyway, if you think of that model, it's going to be, well, compatible in certain respects with the US. It's going to have certain resonance with their values. It's also going to have certain resonance with China's economic system as well, and social system. It's not going to be either one or the other. It lies in between. And we talk about countries increasingly in the world today wanting to be multi-connected. They want to be connected with the US, but they also want to be connected to China. So coming back to South Africa again, they want to be multi-connected, both to China and Russia on the one hand, and the US on the other. And US and Europe, if you like, on one side, and China and Russia on the other. How can they be multi-connected? Or Mongolia is another example, or Cambodia, or Vietnam. All these countries want to be multi-connected in the world today. So how can you be multi-connected, not just politically and economically, but also ideologically? That's what the book is trying to answer. How can you be multi-connected? Well, it sets up a framework around the concept of fraternity, which links both to liberté and to égalité in different ways, and therefore provides a third alternative framework for thinking about the way you organize public life. So it's a very bold book and broad in its aspirations to try and put out a framework that could be used in a future unified Korea, as well as a way of building peace between North and South Korea.
Well, Dr. Schluter, thank you for your time. It's really been interesting to learn more about your book.